So, picture this. It's 1923, a failed armed coup in a Munich beer hall. It really should have been the end of a political career, but instead, it became the launching pad for one of history's most notorious figures. Today, we're diving into the Beer Hall Putsch and the incredible story of how a colossal failure was turned into a strategic victory. And that question, really, it gets to the absolute heart of what we're talking about today. We usually think of failure as the end of the road, right? But what if it's actually the beginning? This very paradox is the key to understanding why the beer hall putsch is so significant. All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 1923, and Germany is just on its knees. We're in post-World War I Munich, a city that's absolutely simmering with resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, and it's crippled by hyperinflation so bad that money is literally cheaper than wallpaper. It's in this super volatile mix that a relatively unknown political agitator sees his chance to seize power. So, the plan was an armed coup, or putsch, which is a direct and violent attempt to overthrow the local government. And the goal was, well, it was incredibly audacious. Take control of Bavaria, then march on Berlin and take over the entire country. It was a real all-or-nothing gamble, one that was inspired by Mussolini's recent march on Rome. So you can imagine a plan this bold, it's a huge risk. And in the short term, oh man, it was a spectacular failure. The aftermath wasn't some glorious victory, but a complete and total collapse of the entire operation. I mean, it just completely fell apart. It was poorly organized, and it was swiftly shut down by police and military forces who decided to stay loyal to the government. In less than a day, the whole rebellion was crushed in a brief, bloody firefight on the streets of Munich. By pretty much every measure you can think of, it was an absolute disaster for Hitler and his movement. And of course, when the coup failed, the consequences were inevitable. Hitler was captured, injured, and put on trial for high treason. Now, this should have been it, the end of his political career, a definitive, humiliating defeat that would send him fading into obscurity. But this is where the story takes a really surprising turn. See, instead of being the end of the line, this total catastrophe actually created a brand new, completely unforeseen opportunity. The prison cell, which should have been a place of political oblivion, was about to become something else entirely, a platform. And this slide right here shows you that central paradox perfectly. On the one hand, yeah, the immediate result was total failure. The coup was crushed, and its leader was thrown in prison. But, and this is the key part, that very failure led to the ultimate outcome. The time in prison allowed him to define his ideology, and the trial gave him the national attention he desperately needed. The very actions meant to shut him down were what ended up giving him his voice. Okay, so this was the first huge thing that came out of his imprisonment. He gets a ridiculously light sentence, right? He's in a pretty comfortable prison, and he has time on his hands. And what does he do with that time? He dictates the book that would become the foundation of his entire political movement, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just him writing his life story. No, this was a blueprint. It laid out a whole worldview based on extreme nationalism, virulent racism, and a very clear vision for aggressive territorial expansion. For the very first time, all his scattered ideas were put down into one single defining document that would later be handed out by the millions. But that wasn't all. There was a second, just as important outcome. See, before the putsch, Hitler was, a local loudmouth in Munich, basically. But his trial for treason, that became a national media sensation. In front of sympathetic judges, he masterfully used the courtroom as his stage, framing his act of treason as patriotism. His speeches were reported in newspapers all over the country, reaching a national audience for the very first time. An audience that was desperate for someone to blame for all their country's problems. So, okay, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Why does this matter so much? Because it's this really powerful and frankly chilling example of how a political movement can flip weakness into strength and how a very public failure can be strategically repackaged into a success. When you boil it all down, this is the real legacy of the beer hall putsch. Tactically, a complete humiliating failure, but strategically, it turned into a massive long-term victory. He learned he couldn't take power by force. Instead, the failure gave him the prison time to write Mein Kampf, and the trial provided the national fame he needed to eventually gain power through the political system itself.
And that really leaves us with this final, kind of provocative question, doesn't it? History is full of moments that seem like endings, but are actually new beginnings. The Beer Hall Putsch is just a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest wins can come from the most obvious defeats. And that's a pattern worth keeping an eye on, time and time again.